Hi, my name is Don Dahl. I chose meat as my topic for my final presentation for Regulatory Food Affairs Course 6120, November 28th, 2013. The reason I chose meat is because I work with grain-based ingredients, and so it kind of got me out of my comfort zone to learn a little bit more about different foods I'm not very familiar with. I've never worked much in the meat industry. So here's an outline of my presentation. I'll start by talking about production and processing and changes that have occurred throughout the 20th century to improve the efficiency of the meat system, preservation of meat throughout the 20th century, distribution, packaging, sales, and other technological improvements. So I'll start out by talking about production and processing. Meat consumption continues to rise in the U.S. Americans consume 270.7 pounds of meat per year, more than any other country. That's statistics from 2007. The world average meat consumption was 102.5 pounds, and the U.S. was nearly three times that. As you can see by the graph here, beef consumption was at an all-time high around 1978 to 1980 and has been falling off steadily since, while poultry consumption continues to rise. The reason for that is probably the perceived healthfulness of chicken and turkey versus beef. The trans fats in beef are not as desirable as poultry products for most consumers. So, in order to keep up with the increasing demands for meat in the United States, some changes had to take place at the farmer level. Some of those changes included raising animals in confinement conditions. So, before, when chickens were raised outside, it was kind of a cyclic process, whereas they would really have one main harvest per year and it would be seasonal. If they brought them inside, they could have six to seven harvests per year because they could actually cycle the seasons indoors using light, temperature, heat cycling. They could also carefully control the food and water consumption of the animal, which allowed for more consistent, larger animals. So chickens brought to market now weigh much more than they ever did before. So chickens that were brought to market in the 1995 weighed 4.7 pounds, whereas in the 40s they would weigh 3 pounds. So these confinement conditions really allowed the farmer to raise larger animals more quickly. Basically, every aspect of the animal can be controlled except for that gestation period from fertilization to birth. So all other aspects of the animal growth needed to be controlled in order to optimize the capacity for meat production. This same thing happened with hogs also. Before they started raising them in confinement conditions, there was a hog rush that the meat industry would call it from mid-October through winter. And that was when the meat packing industry got really busy processing all the hogs. But once they moved them into confinement, they were able to process hogs year round. It also really increased the availability of a variety of meats throughout the United States as they started to raise animals in confinement. Another approach that the industry took was that they started to contract with major processors. So there's only a few companies that really control meat in the United States. And so one company, for instance, Smithfield Farms, would take piglets and they would raise them till they were 8 to 10 weeks old. And then they would give them to contracted farmers who would feed them prescribed feed, prescribed water regimen, antibiotics, things like that to get them up to market weight, and then that major food manufacturer would buy them back and process them. But these contracts really allowed the meat industry to be in more control over the animals that they were processing because they basically got to dial in the exact attributes of the animal that they wanted. Um, they can make a more consistent animal. And the importance of the consistency within animals is that it really allowed for better automation at the meat processing plant. So, as the industry moved more towards growing meat and away from raising animals, one important component that they did was added non therapeutic levels of antibiotics to the feed. What the non therapeutic levels of antibiotics did was they allowed animals to mature more quickly to market weight or to finished weight. So, for instance, a cow raised in 2000 consuming a feed that had antibiotics included would get to market weight in half the time that a cow raised before World War II would have gotten to market weight, and it would have consumed 500 less pounds of feed. So, there's obviously some benefits to using antibiotics for the profit margin for the farmer. About 95% of feeders use DES, which was a common name for stilbestrol, by the 1960s. The government eventually banned DES in the 70s because it had some potential to cause cancer, but all the operators did was they transferred to different antibiotics. And so even today, many farmers use feeds that include antibiotics in order to help get their cattle up to weight more quickly. Um, 80% of all antibiotics are used on factory farm animals, and the majority of those are non therapeutic usages. And so the goal is to get those animals to weight as quickly as possible at any cost. Some changes occurred during the early 20th century to preservation, which allowed for greater availability of a variety of meat products throughout the United States as well. In the early 20th century, salting and smoking was primary means of preservation because most people didn't have refrigeration in their homes. Home refrigeration with freezers didn't come about until the mid 1950s. When the home refrigeration came about, people could buy food and keep it at their home, therefore, they didn't have to consume it as soon as they purchased it, and that really did open up the distribution channel of meat from the industry to individual consumers. Commercial refrigeration came about in the late 19th, early 20th century. That allowed for grocery stores to keep an inventory of meat. It didn't have to be sold as soon as they brought it into the store, and that just increased the flexibility of the store and the consumer for a variety of meat products. Borax and boracic acid were banned by the government in the early 20th century, but before banned, they were used for the curing process. So, in their place, sodium nitrite was used by industry to accelerate curing and maintain color in meat products. Another benefit of sodium nitrite is that it inhibited growth of botulism causing bacteria. Some consumer advocate groups were worried, though, that sodium nitrite had carcinogenic effects. In 1958, James Delancey, a senator, uh, is credited with coming up with the Delancey Clause. What the Delancey Clause does is it ensures that any food additive that's been proven to cause cancer in people or animals is not allowed into our food system. So part of that DES ban that I talked about earlier with antibiotics falls under the Delancey Clause also because it was shown to cause cancer. The consumer advocacy groups that tried to ban sodium nitrite were successful in decreasing the level of sodium nitrite that was acceptable in cured meat products, but they did not get it completely removed from the market. So in 1978, the FDA established rules that required a reduction of nitrites in bacon and other cured meats, and that all falls under the Delancey Clause. Some improvements were made to distribution in order to make meat more accessible and affordable throughout the United States as well in the 20th century. At the beginning of the 20th century, especially late 19th century, animals were shipped via rail car, and it was live animals. They were actually slaughtered at the point where they were going to be consumed, or at least in close proximity to where they were going to be consumed, because we didn't have a good way to ship just the meat. Only about 45% of the weight of a cow is usable in the form of meat, though, so it's obviously not very cost effective to ship live animals. During really cold winter months, meat uh, those who raised cattle would ship just the meat because they didn't have to worry about preservation because it was cold enough outside. But then came the invention of refrigerated rail cars and refrigerated trucks, which allowed for animal processors to ship just carcasses or just actual boxed meat products. This made meat available throughout the United States at a much more affordable price. Some of the most innovative technological changes that occurred for the meat industry during the 20th century, though, in my opinion, really revolve around packaging. Packaging improved leaps and bounds during the 20th century. Cellophane was developed by DuPont Company in the 1920s. There's a 1940s booth that indicated that cellophane made possible packaged meats, made it convenient for people to go to self serve counters at the grocery store and pick out their own piece of meat. Brand identification for repeated sales. So even as costs of some of the raw materials would go up, companies like Oscar Mayer could still sell lunch meats, hot dogs, things like that because the consumer became comfortable with their brand name and their brand name could be displayed on cellophane packages. Visibility. The customer could actually see the color of the meat, see their quality, and it made it more appealing to the actual consumer just from the visibility of it. Eye and appetite appeal. A customer that goes to the grocery store sees meat wrapped in a cellophane wrapper and it looks appetizing, so They get the eye and appetite appeal and maybe get an impulse sale. If the person wasn't coming with the intention of buying several cuts of meat, but they see the meat, they might buy it. It also offered protection for the meat. It offered a barrier from the meat itself to the environment, and it just allowed some protection for the meat. Cellophane had all those benefits, but it wasn't without faults. It was weak and it tore easily, so as it was handled by the consumer, as they were looking through the meat case, trying to find the best value, trying to find the best cut, some of those cellophane packages would get torn. It required the grocery store to keep a person basically on oversight of that meat case to make sure that torn packages were removed so they didn't keep getting handled. It was very hands-on for the meat counter. There's no good way to automate cellophane because it was too thin to put like on an automatic meat wrapper, so they had to have people designated to manually wrap all those meat cuts. And it maintained a fresh meat appearance at 36 degrees for 3 days, but only half of that at 50 degrees. So it wasn't the best barrier for maintaining freshness for meat products. So DuPont next came out with a multi-layer cellophane. Their trade name was MSAD80, and it was a two-layer package. The first layer retarded discoloration and promoted bloom, and it would be right against the meat. The second layer would be heat sealed over the first, and it had different chemical properties. What this did was it allowed migration of oxygen and light only to a certain extent, and it really kind of controlled the freshness of the meat in that package. In the mid 1960s, polyvinyl chloride (PVC) packaging was introduced. It had many benefits over cellophane. It was clearer, it was puncture resistant, and it was easier to automate. So what this did was it allowed the meat manufacturer to actually put this packaging into packaging lines, and right after slaughtering and cutting down the carcass or grinding the meat, they would actually put it directly into PVC packaging, and this allowed that meat manufacturer to ship boxed meat. Next, I'd like to touch on sales of meat just for a minute. Consumption of meat in America is at an all-time high, and McDonald's Corporation is one of the largest beef purchasers in the U.S., accounting for about 3% of total sales. McDonald's first opened in 1940 in San Bernardino, California. In an effort to improve efficiency, it used an assembly line approach. So it was one of the first restaurants that actually made it possible for families to go out to eat in an economical fashion. Pretty much anyone could afford a hamburger from McDonald's. When they first came out, they were 5 cents each. Made it very affordable for even working class and middle class families to go out to eat. In 1948, they added a drive-through. This made it really appealing to those middle class and working families as kind of a different way to go out to eat. It was appealing to go and eat in your car. Drive-throughs became a really novel concept. It offered consistency from restaurant to restaurant, even when franchised. So it became franchised in the 1960s, and no matter which restaurant you went to, you were going to get the same hamburger every time. That's still the benefit today of McDonald's, is no matter where you're at, if you order a hamburger, you know exactly what you're going to get. It made it possible for families of varying incomes to dine outside the home. The last area that I'd like to touch on for advances in the meat industry throughout the 20th century is safety. Improved safety measures have made meat more accessible in different forms. USDA regulations have become more stringent throughout the 20th century to make it safer for the consumer, and improved testing to minimize the risk of foodborne illnesses. Although the USDA has been around since the 19th century, it really became a little bit more prominent in the meat industry through the 20th century. It mandates inspection for wholesomeness, and it offers an optional grading for quality. So when you buy a meat at the grocery store and it says grade A quality beef, that grading is optional, but the wholesomeness and safety of the product is a mandatory inspection. So you can rest assured that whatever meat that you buy at the grocery store is safe. The USDA also implemented the Federal Meat Inspection Act and the Poultry Product Inspection Act, which I'll hit on in the next couple of slides. As part of the USDA, the FSIS, the Food Safety Inspection Service, is responsible for the oversight of state inspection programs. The USDA is responsible for interstate transfers of meat. So meat that's sold across state lines is inspected by the USDA, but many state inspection services are accountable for intrastate transfers, and so meat that's just sold within the state itself is oversaw by the State Inspection Service. The Federal Meat Inspection Act came about at the turn of the 20th century. Most animals were raised close to where they were slaughtered, and the meat was sold locally. As processing, change, as processing changes were made and slaughterhouses grew, safety became of more concern. The Federal Meat Inspection Act provided guidance on the following: ante-mortem inspections of animals, post-mortem inspection of carcasses, slaughtering practice directives, and labeling requirements. The Federal Meat Inspection Act made it mandatory for USDA inspectors to be on site when slaughtering was occurring of animals. They needed to do ante-mortem inspection for the animals to make sure that no animals that were sick or diseased, unable to walk on their own, were slaughtered for human consumption. They were to be isolated and slaughtered for other purposes, non-human consumption. Post-mortem inspection of carcasses. USDA inspectors are on site to ensure that the carcasses are treated as they're supposed to be treated. Slaughtering practice directives. They made it necessary to use humane practices when slaughtering animals, and labeling requirements are a part of the Federal Meat Inspection Act. Poultry Product Inspection Act is basically an equivalent of the Federal Meat Inspection Act, only for poultry products. Postmortem and antemortem inspections of animals are a part of that act, and it's just like the Federal Meat Inspection Act, only on chickens and turkeys. Control over interstate shipments. So this is what I was talking about earlier, where the USDA is responsible for shipments that go between states, whereas state inspection services are responsible for shipments that go within the state. The USDA, FSIS, has oversight of these state programs, though. Sanitary standards within the plant. They offer guidance on sanitary standard operating procedures and guidance on inspection services for state programs. The USDA also offers consumer education. The website provides guidance on cooking standards. It spells out each meat product independently and says what the internal temperature is necessary for cooking to ensure that pathogens of concern are killed. It offers guidance on safe food handling as far as hand washing, cross contamination of poultry with other products, puncturing of beef products. Since E. coli is a surface bacteria, the real risk of E. coli on a beef product is in ground products. So that's why the internal temperature of a ground product is higher than the necessary internal temperature of a whole meat product. It also defines at-risk populations. So it talks about how children are at higher risk for foodborne illness than a middle-aged adult. The elderly are at higher risk. There's special provisions for people with different illnesses, like there's special provisions on the USDA website for cancer patients and the different concerns that they need to be aware of. Foodborne illness and disease education is also a part of this consumer education. Improvements have been made to the testing methods for meat products as well. Polymerase chain reaction testing, PCR testing, for pathogens was introduced in the 1980s. It can be used as a rapid way to determine the presence of pathogens like E. coli 0157H7, Listeria monocytogenes, and Salmonella in real time. E. coli 0157H7 in ground meat from Jack in the Box is responsible for 4 deaths and hundreds of illnesses in 1992. This really heightened public awareness of the potential for foodborne illness to wreak havoc on the consumers. A book was published called Poisoned that outlined this outbreak and talks about minimum cooking temperature for ground beef and the potential for illness associated with improper food handling. So in conclusion, several advances have been made in the meat industry in the 20th century. Production and processing, preservation, distribution, packaging, sales, and other technological improvements have all played a part in the increased demand for meat throughout the United States and throughout the world. All of these aspects have worked together to make sure that meat products are available and affordable for all the consumers and safe. Thank you. Feel free to contact me with any questions you may have at the email address provided or through my NEU email address. This class has been a really great course and I've really enjoyed interacting with all of you. Thank you.